Welcome everyone to Keep It Classy Tech. In this video I'm going to be looking at dynamic tone mapping on and off in HDR as well as in Dolby Vision using Cinema versus Cinema Home. So I'm going to start off with some measurements and brightness measurements as well. So here is HDR Cinema mode with what the TV calls HDR tone mapping turned off, and then when we switch over to the same mode, no other changes but turning it on, you can see there's just a slight rise at the high end and a little bit of a dip in the mid-range. And then here's the full pre-cal measurements, again with it turned off and then again with it turned on. You see pretty much the same thing. It drops kind of the middle but raises the height. The problem is this is not representative of real content. So most of this video is going to be showing actual real content, what this difference makes. And then when it comes to Dolby Vision, so Cinema versus Cinema Home in HDR10, if you set the settings the same, they measure the same with Filmmaker mode. In Dolby Vision, it's different. Cinema Home and Dolby Vision appears to be applying its own version of a dynamic tone mapping that cannot be turned off. So there is a difference when using Dolby Vision. So before we get into the real content, here's just some brightness measurements. Sped this up a little bit. In HDR, it doesn't matter if it's Cinema or Cinema Home, and it doesn't matter if the HDR tone mapping is turned on or off. It's going to measure about 765 to 770 nits on this particular panel, and that's not the absolute most that this TV can do, as I will show later, probably in another video, but that's another discussion. Anyway, the point is, turning on and off tone mapping and switching the modes in the HDR10 settings does not affect the actual measurements at all. But let's get into real content and see what happens. So here is Dolby Vision. It's Black Widow. It's a fairly dark overall scene with an explosion in the back. So I put the meter on what appears to be the brightest point in the image, and right now it's in Dolby Vision Cinema mode. And I'm going to be using the same settings. Color temperature will always be at 45, warm 45, as that puts it closest to D65 for the 77-inch G1. And then all the brightness stuff is left where it should be in HDR Dolby Vision at max, screen brightness at 50, and so on. So right now with Dolby Vision, what I want to check is what happens when you switch between Cinema mode and Cinema Home. So you can also see all of the AI stuff is turned off, and I check this for each mode that I test. And I have 3 different scenes from Black Widow that I'm going to use. This one, like I said, is a mostly dark with a bright spot, and then there's going to be another one where it's more of a mid-range brightness with a bright spot, and then at the end we'll do a, it's all white and super bright. So again, those measurements at the beginning, they're important, but they really don't show what dynamic settings are doing, because you're being presented just a static pattern, and therefore there's nothing for it to change really. So that's why I wanted to use real content in a few different types of scenes and see what happens. So let me just start off and say, too, having HDR tone mapping setting, which again is poorly named, it should be called dynamic tone mapping, but having that disabled is going to be the most accurate, and in Dolby Vision using Cinema mode is going to be more accurate than Cinema Home. So if you don't want your midtones raised and messed with, and you don't want your HDR highlights to be affected and so on, you would just leave the tone mapping off, or in Dolby Vision you would be using Cinema, and that's it. But not everyone cares about perfect accuracy, and not everyone's going to view in the same kind of environment. So I want to see what effects happen when making those changes. Alright, so here in this scene with it on Cinema mode, which is the more accurate, we were getting over 280 nits in this spot. And then with Cinema Home, which is appearing to make the image brighter, it was actually dropping that down to under 240 or so. And we can see as we change the picture modes to standard and vivid, it's still going down, or is at least lower than using Cinema, even though those are supposed to technically be brighter. Well, the reason for that is in a scene like this, it's spending a lot more energy trying to raise all the darker areas that otherwise it could be sending to that bright highlight. So using cinema mode is going to have brighter highlights in a scene like this. But as we'll find out later, in different types of scenes, that changes. So which one should you use? Well, again, if you want accuracy, you want to use cinema mode. That's how it was originally shot. That's how it's supposed to be. So like in a dark scene with a bright spot like this, it keeps all the dark stuff as dark as it's supposed to be while having that bright spot get as bright as it can. However, if it's, a really bright room, or you just like the midtones raised or whatever, then you could use Cinema Home and have that kind of look as well. But like I said, that appears to be having its own version of like a dynamic tone mapping going on, although we're talking about Dolby Vision, which kind of already does that, so it's kind of like just a different algorithm that it's using. And then here, I just wanted to show that even if you did drop the color temperature very, like a drastic amount, it's not changing anything with the brightness. It doesn't really work that way, so don't think that you can get it brighter just by running a cooler temperature. There's really no reason for that. Alright, so now I'm going to switch this over to HDR10 by disabling Dolby Vision on the Shield, which I'm using to play this movie. And now we're going to just show that if you have Cinema and Cinema Home, and really any of the picture modes, if you put all the settings the same, they look the same, they measure the same, everything's the same. It's only Dolby Vision that's forcing a difference with Cinema Home versus Cinema. So again, all the AI stuff is turned off, we're still at warm 45, and now I'm going to measure Cinema and Cinema Home, and with dynamic tone mapping or HDR tone mapping on versus off. So we hit 290 nits with tone mapping turned off in cinema mode. But don't compare that to the previous Dolby Vision numbers. There is a bit difference in the frame here. The movie being paused for so long, after a while it'll start to dim and then it'll actually go to a screensaver, so I had to re-go back into the movie, and Disney Plus doesn't give you a frame by frame fast forward and rewind, so it was kind of hard to get it as close as possible, but at least when it's in the same clip. So with the Dolby Vision comparison, I was able to get those done before any change was made, and then with the HDR stuff, I was able to get that done before any change was made. And I also have to quit out and go into the settings to change it from Dolby Vision to HDR. So it's not a direct comparison from the Dolby Vision numbers to the HDR numbers. All that matters right now is we're just checking the differences in using the tone mapping versus not using it, and the difference in the modes on Dolby Vision. So anyway, here also showing even in Filmmaker, it's the same as Cinema or Cinema Home. So where the meter is, that part of this scene is measuring about 290-ish nits on all the modes. Alright, now I'm going to switch back and forth real quick between them to show that there's literally no change in the image, none of the midtones, none of the shadows, nothing is changing between the modes when they're at the same settings. And again, that's for HDR, but again, in Dolby Vision, there is behind the scenes differences between Cinema and Cinema Home that you can't change. Alright, now here's where I had to exit out and go back in. The frame changed a little bit, so just a retest for this part here now, specifically for the tone mapping setting, we're at 277 nits with HDR tone mapping turned off in cinema mode. I'm going to turn tone mapping on and then see how it measures. And you can see a visual change just by toggling it like that. So let's see how it measures now. And we're actually a little bit brighter. So we went from 277, let's say 280, up to about 290. So what's going on? Well, in this scene, it seems like the dynamic tone mapping setting is doing a good job at realizing that it's supposed to be a darker scene with a bright spot, and it's actually increasing the brightness of that bright spot. That's not always the case, that's not always what happens, but here it's actually doing a good job. And since we already established Cinema and Cinema Home are the same, I can toggle back and forth while having tone mapping turned on Cinema and turned off on Cinema Home, and just show a quick comparison like that without having to pull up the whole settings menu. So now here we are again with another reset of the scene. So now we're at 280-ish nits, and tone mapping is off. So now I'm going to try dynamic contrast, because there's going to be someone saying, well, what about dynamic contrast? So might as well check it. And it's pretty much, as most of you should expect, it makes it worse. So still don't recommend using dynamic contrast ever, especially on an OLED. And in the later scene, later in the video, I'll show dynamic contrast on medium-low also. And if we had dynamic contrast with tone mapping, because there's going to be someone asking about that as well, again, it makes things worse. It's not better. Just don't use the dynamic contrast setting, period. So when the number is really low like that at first, that's just because the menu is up. You have to wait for the next measurement. So that's why I'll leave the camera there and you can see that happen. Alright, so now for the next scene. This is like a mid-level brightness scene. More of the screen is bright. So in cinema mode, HDR 10 with the HDR tone mapping setting turned off. It's about 240, 245 nits. So I'm going to turn the tone mapping setting to on. And when I do it here, take note of everything else in the image. You can see how it raised everything in this kind of scene. So something that may be beneficial to doing that is the shadow detail gets raised up. So then you don't end up with as much crushed shadow details, or crushed near black, or whatever you want to call it. So now, also, on top of doing that, it did increase that highlight right there by quite a large margin. So there's quite a long discussion too to be had about people who say that OLEDs are too dim. Well, most of that is because they're used to an LCD in SDR that's been way brighter than what SDR is supposed to be, which is 100 nits. And then there's a correlation with HDR where just because a highlight is supposed to be 6, 7, 800,000, 2,000, however many nits, doesn't mean the whole scene is. The whole scene is supposed to be similar to SDR with just bright highlights. So, we'll talk about that another time. The point I'm trying to make is that using that tone mapping setting, if you like that, if you like the brighter midtones and the brighter low range, you can turn that setting on, and then you may not feel about OLEDs being too dim anymore, if that's your preference. Again, not accurate if it's your preference. So now, same scene, again, different frame, but looking into Dolby Vision, cinema versus cinema home. And again, it's kind of similar to what we were seeing with HDR having tone mapping on versus off. You switch it over to cinema home and you just see that whole scene just shoots up in brightness, including the highlight. So using cinema home for Dolby Vision, or using the HDR tone mapping turned on for HDR 10, the benefits to those is if you're in a bright room and you think the image is just too dim, it's too dark, whatever you're watching, you just want it to be a bit brighter, that's what you can do. If you also think that your shadows are just too dark and the near black is just too dark, getting crushed, again, you can use cinema home for Dolby Vision or HDR tone mapping turned on for HDR 10, and it will raise those. And that's why I think LG actually probably set their calibration with those turned on, because they probably figure most people are going to like the way that looks and have either HDR tone mapping turned on for HDR 10 or be using cinema home in the home. And I think that's why there is the near black, shadow detail is too dark issue that LG doesn't do anything about, because if they did, it would mess up what they did with those settings or modes. So if you really think about it, average person, they put it on cinema home for Dolby Vision, and they just put it on cinema home for HDR 10 as well, which defaults with tone mapping turned on, and then they don't touch anything. And then they never experience those shadows being crushed or too dark. And it's only when you go in and try to make it more accurate that you run into that problem, and then you have to fix that with calibration. So here's the next scene. You can see it's really bright, a lot of snow, And again, same test, switching between Dolby Vision Cinema and Cinema Home. And here there's not a huge difference, but because it's such a bright overall white scene, there's really not much for it to try and brighten up, as it's pretty much all bright to begin with. However, in HDR10, it's a bit different again. So now, again, I had to reset it, so slightly different frame. Don't compare to the Dolby Vision numbers. But here we are with Cinema and HDR Tone Mapping turned off in a very bright overall scene. And it's getting 290, just shy of 300 nits, say 295. And then we turn the tone mapping on. And what you're going to see is, in my opinion, again, it's not accurate, but I think it's doing a good job in that it's actually taking some of that energy away from the midtones this time and then sending it to the brighter areas. So you can see how the wall of snow that's darker gets even more darker, and then the pure white of the snow falling down the hill gets even brighter. So it gives more of that HDR impact, and now we're pushed up to 365. So it's an increase of 80 nits, so what, 35, 40 something percent brighter in that spot. Like, it really is noticeable in person to see that change. It does give more impact. However, you do lose some detail, and it's not accurate, but again, I don't think the average person's going to care. I think they're just going to want that brighter white snow. So before looking into this and really experimenting, if you just go by the numbers, you just go by the measurements, you go by what is accurate and what you're told, then that's where, my settings videos before were all based on that, about accuracy and what you're technically supposed to use. And I'll still stand by that. I'll still use that for myself. But I also know most people out there don't want that. Most people want that extra oomph. So, you got to try it out for yourself and see, and just use what you like. Now, just for a little bonus, a little sneak peek into something else I'm working on, and we're going to try to have a stream probably Thursday the 14th with Ninjishin, and I'll see who else wants to join. But boost mode in the game optimizer menu does more than you think. Here you can see it just hit the highest number just by turning that on. So if you're in game mode and you have boost mode off, you're going to get less brightness than in one of the movie modes. But if you're in game mode, you turn that boost mode on, it's actually the brightest that I see this TV get to. So I know this video is running quite long, and if you've made it this far, then you got a little bonus right there. But yeah, that is something I'm looking into. There are drawbacks and side effects of using boost mode that I'm also going to be talking about in the next video when I get that one done. And I'm going to try my best to get that done before the stream so I can talk about this video and that video in the stream, answer any questions that you guys have. But no, I'm not recommending anybody start watching movies in game mode with boost mode on so that you get more brightness. That's not what I'm saying. So don't take it like that. But again, if you're gaming and you want more brightness, you can kind of see a little bit of the settings I have there with the white at 9, and I had the screen brightness at 49. Again, just another sneak peek. That helps a lot. I'll explain all that in a gaming video so this doesn't run on forever. So here at the end, just showing I did go through auto dynamic contrast, high, medium, low. It makes changes, nothing that I suggest anyone use. Just try to get this over with because we're going on 20 minutes now. Don't recommend using the auto contrast setting. But anyway, long story short, try having the HDR tone mapping turned on and off in different kinds of content and even different scenes of that same content, and just use what you like. If you want accuracy and you want to know that's what it's supposed to look like, turn it off. If it's not bright enough for you personally and you want that extra mid-tone push, just know that there's going to be some scenes where you're sacrificing your highlights to make everything else brighter, but there's going to be other scenes where it's actually going to decrease some of the midtones to push the highlights brighter. That's why it's dynamic. And in Dolby Vision, just consider the cinema home setting to be home with dynamic tone mapping turned on. And that's about it. So keep an eye out for the upcoming gaming video. As far as a shadow detail or black crush video follow up to my previous ones, finding all of this out puts a huge kink into that. Pretty much for SDR, it should be a pretty simple thing for me to figure out, but with HDR and Dolby Vision, it's either best to leave it alone or do what's been discussed in this video. So anyway, I know it's been long. Thank you if you stuck it out, and I hope this helps. And if you liked it, please hit the like button so that other people can see it. And if you're going to be buying anything on Amazon in the next day or so, check the description for some affiliate links. You don't have to buy that item. You can buy anything at all on Amazon. If you just follow one of those links, you'll help support my channel. And I guess that's it. So thanks for watching. Have a good one. I'll catch you in the next one.